Okay, guys. So Mr. Slater and I tried to do what we did the last time, which is where Mr. Slater led the lectures on Hitler, and I kind of jumped in and asked some questions here and there. But there is something about my internet or my Chromebook or a combination of the two. It was just impossible to do. My video kept cutting in and out, and so we decided that this is probably how it's going to have to be. Where I will just go ahead and lead the lecture alone using this different program called Screencastify. So this does say the Ivy 20th Century Show hosted by Slater and Novelli, but Mr. Slater is not here. He is here in spirit, though. So I'm going to start the Castro stuff today. We are going to be basically looking at the life of Fidel Castro starting around age 18 when he is a college student at the University of Havana. And then going all the way through his imprisonment after a failed military attack. So we're going to be looking at just a little bit today. So let's get into it here. So one thing I do want to point out is that in Mr. Bouchard's class, and then also earlier in the year, back when we were at school, we spent a fair amount of time talking about some of the conditions that were already present in Cuba. So what I'm looking at here is, or what I'm kind of referencing, is kind of the legacy of imperialism on Cuba, as well as the effect that Western interests had on the Cuban people and how that kind of affected their psyche. So that's something that we should keep in mind this entire time, but I'm not going to re-lecture on all that again. But we should keep in mind the legacy of imperialism and how that affects how Cubans view both like foreigners and the effect that it had on their political system. So this idea of social rebellion, economic upheaval, this is all because of over the last several decades. Hey, don't do that. Sorry, my cat is messing with something. Over the last couple decades, throughout Cuban society, they've been heavily affected by the entrance of other countries over their own. So we're going to start here with a young Fidel Castro. So he entered the University of Havana in the autumn of 45, even at an early age, at 18. He knew that he wanted to have a great impact on Cuban society. He has his own quote here: "From all indications, I was born to be a politician, to be a revolutionary." Fidel was one of those people, we all, probably know people like this. He just seemed to succeed at everything. He oozed confidence in a lot of the things that he did. He was a tremendous baseball player, actually. He was a very, very good pitcher. He was recruited by the New York Giants. He could have played professional baseball in America, but he didn't want to. He really had a calling to this kind of idea of being a revolutionary. And so his first experience with being a revolutionary was actually in 1947. He was contacted through the leader of Cuba at the time, which was a man by the name of Pais. And they wanted to go ahead and try and overthrow a right-wing dictator in the Dominican Republic named Trujillo. And this kind of loosely fits in with what we were seeing a lot in Latin America and Central America at this time, is that there were a lot of these repressive right-wing governments that were kind of ruling through what they called at the time a military junta, which is basically where a general rules the country through force because he commands the military. And in a lot of ways, this is kind of what Batista did. And so, he sees Fidel kind of sees himself as a champion of the repressed. And so he says, heck yeah, I want to try and join to overthrow Trujillo. However, this coup ends up being a failure. And it's a failure because the plan was supposed to be secretive, but it was leaked to the Dominicans. And so in order to prevent his own people from being massacred, Pais basically tells the Cubans that we need to come back. We can't do this because they're going to crush us because they already know that we're coming. However, this had a really important effect on Castro's psychology of revolution, that they call it, because he loved this. He found it to be extremely exciting to take place in this kind of military adventure, especially in the name of something of overthrowing those that repress others, in the name of democracy. So this was like extremely exciting to Castro, and it was all that he really wanted to do. So at the university, when he returned, he kind of had a reputation of being a rabble rouser, as they call it. I don't really think that phrase is used very much anymore, but you get the idea. And then something else I really want to point out is that at the time and through the majority of his public life, prior to becoming the leader of Cuba, he spoke out against repression, communism, and dictatorships. And so I want to talk about this for a second because this is a great example of something that I try to talk about frequently when we study history. We have a tendency, I don't know, it's like human nature, that we want to classify people as being wholly good or wholly bad. And I don't mean like holy like religious, I mean holy as in a whole sense. And the reality is that almost all people have elements of good parts and bad parts to what makes them, to what constitutes how they're viewed by others. So there are elements of Castro that we're going to learn about where you would broadly say are somewhat, altruistic in so far to say that he did some things that a lot of people would agree were for the better of Cuban society and were ultimately good. There's also going to be elements of Castro that are not so good, but we will get to that when we get to methods. Now, the reason why I bring this up is because, we think of Castro in the after effect once he became the authoritarian of Cuba, and he kind of gets connected, he gets kind of inextricably associated with the Soviet Union and communism. But I think it's very important to point out that until that point, he was very much against communism. And even the entire time that he leads up to leading Cuba, there is not a single public statement that connects Castro with being friendly to communism. And in fact, there are several examples of him actually criticizing communism. So that's commonly misrepresented, and it's something that we should keep in mind. And then, as I kind of already indicated, he saw himself as a champion of the oppressed. So he graduates from law school in 1950 and immediately becomes involved with Cuban politics. This is important. Now, I'm not going to get into the ups and downs of Cuban politics because it's kind of dizzying and it's not totally relevant to everything that we're studying here. But the person that we need to know is this guy, Eddie Chivas, okay, of the Ortodoxo Party. This is who Castro kind of throws his political weight behind, and this is who he wants to support in the June 1st, 1952 election in Cuba. However, Fulgencio Batista institutes a coup d'etat in March of 52, on March 10th. And so remember, a coup d'etat, this is a forceful military overthrow. Batista has a long history of being connected with the Cuban military. It's how his introduction to public life began. This will be his third stint as president of Cuba, and it's a coup d'etat. So this is an unlawful overthrow of the political powers. So he basically says a couple months before the election, you know what? We don't need to have the election. I'm going to run the country again. I know how to do it best. We don't need to have an election. I'm best suited for it. I have the military behind me. What are you going to do to stop me? So obviously, Castro and other members of this party, they find this reprehensible. And so what do? They challenge it in the courts. The courts decide if things are legal, right? So what did the courts say? The courts supported Batista's coup d'etat. Okay, so Castro at this time, essentially in 52, says, okay, I've exhausted all of my legal methods to try and stop this from happening. So what am I going to have to do? I'm going to have to start to do things that would be considered illegal. They sought weapons. Okay, that's what else am I supposed to do? Is what Castro essentially believed. So I don't know if this is blocking you guys. Whatever. So he kind of coalesces about 200 other student activists, and they say, you know what? We are going to overthrow this dictator. And there's only one way to do it, through force. He kind of channeled a famous phrase from Mao Zedong, change must come through the barrel of a gun. Okay, so that's kind of how he viewed what he needed to do. And so he has a little experience doing this already. He did the training to overthrow Trujillo. And he said, well, you know what? I can do this in my own country, certainly. So over the next year, they focused on three things. Sorry. They wanted to gather weapons. They wanted to train with the weapons. And they wanted to formulate a plan to overthrow 2 military garrisons in Cuba. So the only reason that they wanted to overthrow these military garrisons is not to kill officers of the Cuban military, but because these garrisons had armories, and armories contain a wealth of weapons. And if he could get more weapons and arm more people, he would become a viable force to overthrow this military dictator, because that's the only thing that Batista would recognize is force. Okay, the courts, the legal system, this weakness of the political system, it was not going to protect Batista. So we are now into 1953, and this fortress becomes very famous for a couple reasons. And some of you might have remembered this from some of our previous lectures and what Mr. Bouchard taught you. But this Moncada fortress in Santiago, that was the main target. He didn't want to occupy it. He didn't want to kill the people in there necessarily, although that did happen, just because it's kind of just it's what's going to happen if you use military force to seize a military installation. But he really just wanted the ammunition and the weapons. So they had about 95 rebels for the Moncada fortress, and they were really a ragtag group of people. They didn't have uniforms. They had low caliber rifles. This was almost entirely going to be predicated on surprise. It was the only way that they were going to experience any success, what we kind of broadly define as guerrilla warfare. But it's going to be a massive failure because they don't have enough reconnaissance to really effectively complete this military attack. The rebels were unfamiliar with the layout of the base and even the city in general. There were several cars that were supposed to arrive at the same time, and they got lost. And in fact, Fidel Castro himself, he was in a car that became face-to-face with one of the army patrols, and they got in an immediate firefight. Castro didn't get shot, but he fired his weapon several times. They kind of sped away. The firefight is obviously extremely loud, so the rest of the base knows, holy crap, we're under attack. And so they've lost the element of surprise. Castro has to call all of his forces to retreat. We cannot continue with the attack. The military chases after them. They capture or kill all of the members of his party. So Castro is actually caught in the mountains about 2 days later, and then they're all brought back to be tried, those that haven't been killed. Now, there are about 27 rebels that were caught. Half of them were executed after they were caught, and then the remaining, Castro and his brother included, they were held on trial. Now, what's interesting here, especially given what we've already covered in when we looked at Hitler, is that the parallels here. I mean, I hope that we're making this connection here. So Hitler tries to organize an angry mob of people to overthrow the government, okay? And I'm talking about the beer hall putsch here, okay? So this is this Bavarian rage, okay? Now we have Fidel. Now, he's not directly trying to overthrow the government yet, but that's his ultimate goal. He is descending upon this military installation, and just like Hitler, it fails militarily speaking. From a strategic standpoint, it has failed. Okay, and then furthermore, we have another parallel to what happened with Hitler, because when their trials take place, they are both allowed to speak for hours on end, defending their positions and explaining themselves. Now, in the case of Castro, he was his own lawyer. So he was easily allotted a lot more time than Hitler was. But just like Hitler, he was given a tremendous amount of latitude to speak about whatever he wanted. So he could criticize the government. He could criticize Batista. He could kind of expound upon what his political beliefs are, what his intentions were, why he felt justified. And he basically outlined the platform for how he viewed Cuban society should be. So it became this like massive PR campaign for Fidel. So that's really important to keep in mind because it's just interesting to look at the comparison between the two, because even though they weren't able to succeed in what they explicitly set out to do, you know, when past becomes prologue, you can look back and you can say, well, this was instrumental to the rise of both of these leaders. You know, in the case of Castro, do we know for sure if he would have been able to ascend to the leader of Cuba without this failed attack? Like if he had succeeded, would the outcome have been the same? I don't know. It's an interesting thing to think about, but very important to keep in mind. So he's found guilty, and they're all given a range of sentences, and they're going to this military installation on an island called the Isle of Pines, and this is where most political prisoners went at the time. So in the trial, this is where Castro also gives his famous "History will absolve me." So I'm going to read through this really quickly because this is very famous. So this is at the very end prior to him being sentenced. "I have reached the end of my defense, but I will not do what all lawyers do, asking freedom for the accused. I cannot ask that. When my companions are already suffering in the ignominious prison of the Isle of Pines, send me to join them and to share their fate. It is understandable that men of honor should be dead or prisoners in a republic whose president is a criminal and a thief. As for me, I know that prison will be harder for me than it ever has been for anybody, filled with threats, ruin, and cowardly deeds of rage, but I do not fear it, as I do not fear the fury of the wretched tyrant who snuffed out the lives of 70 brothers of mine. Condemn me. It does not matter. History will absolve me." Okay, so, if you're angry and frustrated with government and then you read this, you're immediately a fan of Fidel. Okay, he's a champion of what you believe in your heart. And then furthermore, and this can't be ignored, it's very charismatic. Even reading this right now, it's like, it pumps you up. So this is definitely one of his greatest attributes. So let's talk about his imprisonment. Okay. Well, actually, before that, like I was saying, this is the first time the Cuban people were able to directly hear what happened at Moncada and the accusation of Fidel Castro at the trials. So he becomes kind of a martyr among the folks in society who were anti-Batista, created a tremendous platform for Castro. And then, this is something I don't really understand. And something else that I have a question of is I'm surprised Batista didn't kill Castro. He must have not seen him as a threat at all, because it wasn't like he was, a tremendous fan of the rule of law. I mean, he came to power from a coup d'etat in the first place. So you have somebody here attacking a military institution. You could classify him as a traitor because he's a Cuban attacking Cubans. I'm surprised he didn't get executed. He executed other members of the group. So why wouldn't he execute the leader? I don't really understand it. And then furthermore, he takes all of these people and then he puts them on an island together. So what do you think they're going to do when they're there? They're going to plan, they're going to train. So October of 53, they're on the Isle of Pines. Oops, that should say revolutionary. Sorry. Plotting while they're incarcerated. And they basically make a plan when we all get released because Cuba's not safe. We're all going to Mexico and we're going to plan. So they said, we have all this support now because people view us as martyrs because we had brothers who died for this cause, and we had this tremendous platform for Castro to give a speech. We're going to have all these supporters. We just have to organize, and we can institute plans that are even grander and more effective than what we had before. And in fact, this prison was so unstructured. They were kind of left to their own devices the whole time that they were there. So Fidel organizes a school while he's in prison. And in addition to the prisoners, in addition to the members of the failed Moncada barracks that were imprisoned, there were also a bunch of other military or political prisoners that were disaffected with Batista. And so he basically grew his audience while in prison. He had all kinds of classes ranging from history to philosophy, politics, social issues. He taught weapons trainings. Obviously, they didn't have weapons, but he taught the basics of weapons training. He was able to keep his revolutionary spark alive. And in fact, he brought the prison close to revolution himself. And eventually they got tired of that. And so he was put in solitary confinement. Which they probably should have done initially, but they consistently were underestimating Fidel. So about 3 years later, we're going forward to 1955. Batista actually runs, but he runs unopposed for president, and he wins. Bravo for winning unopposed. So he felt like, I just won. I'm in power again. Everything's going relatively well. So there was growing opposition that he needed to release political prisoners. So he figured he'd throw him a bone. He'd give him a bit of a present. And so shortly after his presidential victory, he granted amnesty to all political prisoners in Cuba. So on May 13th, 1955, That's when they were all granted. And 2 days later, Fidel Castro and the other survivors of the Moncada barracks were released. So, if you recall, like I just said, Castro said, when I get released, we're all going to go to Mexico. And so in July of that year, he goes to Mexico. But prior to leaving, he writes this letter, which is kind of indicative of where his mindset was at the time. So, I'm packing for my departure from Cuba, but I have had to borrow money even to pay for my passport. After all, it is not a millionaire who is leaving, only a Cuban who has given and will go on giving everything to his country. All doors to a peaceful political struggle had been closed to me. Like Marti, so he's talking about Jose Marti, who is I don't want to use that word, but he was a pillar of the revolutionary society. Like Marti, I think the time has come to seize our rights instead of asking for them, to grab instead of beg for them. Cuban patience has its limits. I will live somewhere in the Caribbean. There is no going back possible in this kind of journey, and if I return, it will be with tyranny beheaded at my feet. Okay, so he's going to leave about a month later in June of 55. Okay, so next week we're going to pick up with what happens after he returns from his planning in Mexico. He's going to have a series of trips to the United States. He's going to have some support in the United States, some support in Mexico, and Batista is going to realize that he has made a pretty serious mistake. So that's what we have for today. I'm sorry that Mr. Slater couldn't be here with us. It was just my internet's kind of messed up. You're going to have a Google form assignment that's going to be on Classroom. Make sure to do your check-ins so that we can see you for attendance. We miss seeing you guys. I hope you guys are doing okay. It was good to see some of you at the Regalia ceremony last week. And hopefully we're going to be able to figure out some way to see each other again soon. But otherwise, I hope you guys have a great day. It feels good to lecture again, and I will talk to you. All right, stop.